Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about the books that I have recently read, and I have two of them. The first one is a Gothic work from the 1820s, and the other one is a very famous piece of 20th century journalism related to the bombing of Hiroshima. So first I'm going to talk about this one, this Gothic work. So I have been on an sort of a journey over the past, year or so now, of exploring Gothic literature in a largely chronological sense, starting with the earliest works in the 18th century and working my way up through the 19th century. And I am now at the 1820s. And I'm hitting the big hitters, but I am more concerned also with getting the things that are influential, and I do want to find some of the more obscure stuff. Now, I'm not really doing this alone. I've been joined along by some other people, some other booktubers, Mark from Book Time with Elvis, Greg from Another Bibliophile Reads, very recently for this one, Sean D. Standfast. They don't read all of them with me, but they've read quite a few of them, and it's always great to hear their thoughts. And some things that we have read have been really big hits. One of the biggest ones, I think, has been Matthew Lewis's The Monk from the 1790s. We all really enjoyed that. And aside from Frankenstein, I think a lot of the stuff since then has been sort of middling. Nothing that has grabbed us like The Monk did. But for me personally, this has been one of the best since The Monk. So this is James Hogg, a Scottish writer, writing in the list was published in 1824. And we have a really interesting book that is doing a lot. It's actually very sophisticated in its ideas and I think in its execution. I do overall enjoy the writing in this as well. And we have a very odd structure. This is the Private Memoirs and Confessions. Confessions were very popular during this time. One of the previous Gothic works, sort of Gothic, it's more influence on the Gothic is why we read it. That was Thomas Delancey. Is that Thomas De Quincey? Thomas De Quincey, I think, right? Confessions of an Opium Eater. Confessions were all the rage, and this is a fake confession, and it has a very interesting sort of structure where we have at first the editor's narrative, where it's a fake editor who is essentially talking about information that he's gathered about something that happened 100 years ago. So we're talking the early 1700s. And based on evidence that he's found and local traditions, he's kind of piecing together what occurred between two brothers, George and Robert. They are both the sons of this, wealthy landowner. This landowner had married a very religious woman, an extremely religious woman. And it's not the landowner wasn't religious, but he is not super self-righteous pious. And, he still likes to have a good time and just kind of chill out. And she is a very strict, kind of a Calvinist extremist. And she falls in with this Reverend character named Ringham, I think is, if I'm saying that correctly. And this husband and wife basically decide they're going to live under the same roof, but on opposite sides of the house. But she somehow does get pregnant twice. The first son, George, appears to be the landowner, the wealthy man's son. Not entirely sure about the second son, Robert. There's a lot of suggestion that maybe it's actually the Reverend's child. But these two children are raised separately. So Robert is raised by his mother, and the Reverend is kind of a father. I don't know if he's the real father or just the surrogate father. And George is raised by his biological father. And George overall does grow to be a pretty decent guy, it seems, while Robert is a kind of dangerous zealot. And there's a conflict, there's a competition between these two brothers that does ending in murder. So then we end up switching the narrative. Then we have the titular confessions, where we have Robert Ringham, that one brother that was extremely religious. We have his personal account, and essentially his belief that through his kind of extreme Calvinism that he has been predestined for heaven. So because God had predestined him since, the dawn of time, if not beforehand, nothing he could do, no sin could he commit to keep him from heaven. So he can sin, he can murder, he can pretty much do whatever he wants. And he wants to also punish sinners. And so killing sinners, people who are destined for hell anyway, it's becomes one of his preoccupations. And he's joined by a very mysterious figure who seems to be able to look like other people at will and sound like them. Well, maybe sound like them, at least look like them. Somebody who seems to say all the right things doctrinally and leads him further and further down a path of murder. And this is really a Satan figure. But this is not Satan working through people by bringing them away from religion. It is about them becoming fanatically religious and doing terrible things. So it's Satan using the scripture, using religion against the believer to make them wicked, which is very interesting, especially in our era of, dealing with religious extremism in various ways. I think that we can still relate quite a bit to what is going on there. And then we once again return to I think it's still the editor again. Just double checking, yeah. And this time we are talking about a suicide's grave and something that was buried 100 years ago, and some people end up finding it and digging it up and the things that they find in there. And it kind of calls into question all the different things that we have read and exactly what occurred. So Hogg is really playing at very different, multiple layers, different levels. He's constantly using an ambiguous style narrative to allow us to kind of come to our own conclusions, but suggesting some really interesting things. He also does give us some interesting heroines, female characters. We have two women who are essentially heroes of the story. I'm trying to not be spoilery here. I'm trying to be as as general as possible. But these two women are, one of them was basically a mistress and the other one's a prostitute. And they are essentially the heroes of our story, which I think is awesome, that we have people from the lower classes that generally would not be given the time of day, really being the moral heroes, both, I would say, in spirit and in actuality within this book, which I just think is pretty awesome. And another thing that I think is really great about the book is it deals a lot with doubling and doppelgangers. And I can only imagine that it was an influence on something like Edgar Allan Poe and his works, but it definitely was an influence on Robert Louis Stevenson and Jekyll and Hyde. I guess he was quite enamored with this book. And I can see why. So we have a lot of doubling. I already mentioned the two brothers, kind of two mother figures, two father figures. We have this kind of Satan character who can literally become a doppelganger to people and double. And not only that, we get the story from the editor's narrative, but then we get it retold from Robert's point of view. And so we see certain situations. It's the same incident, the same scene, but we see it from his point of view. And we can get a sense that he is not necessarily being truthful in a lot of ways. He makes himself look a lot better in his version of things than what the editor has to say. And it's really interesting to see those differences. But once again, that's, a form of doubling. There's even more to it. I don't want to give it all away, but I really did end up enjoying this. Unfortunately, when this was published, it really wasn't a hit at all. I don't think that a lot of people were catching on to the understanding that the narrative structure that he was doing here. And also it seems like a lot of people seem to have misunderstood the theological underpinnings and the things that he was I don't know about maybe criticizing or cautioning against, or maybe just having some fun with, but especially how he was playing with ideas of predestination and taking it to some very murderous extremes in conclusion. But it did not sell very well. I think there were like 1,000 copies printed and only a couple hundred were sold. And then when he died, it was posthumously republished, but it was highly edited. I guess they changed a lot of the theological stuff and even some of the more violent stuff. So it wasn't the same book at all. And it wasn't restored again until, if I'm remembering correctly, the 1890s, I think. And then it really wasn't even given credit again until the mid-20th century when they realized really what a cool work it is. So Anyhow, I really like this. This is definitely one of my favorites that we've read in a while. So if that sounds interesting to you, I mean, remember it is the 1820s, so you'll have to be okay with that writing style from that time, which is certainly not exactly like what we have today. But I thought the story was fascinating, and I really liked it, and really glad I read it. So that is, once again, The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. And then I read this one, John Hersey's Hiroshima. I am a middle school social studies teacher, and one of the units that I teach is on Japan. And we look at modern day Japan, and we look at their geography and their, lack of natural resources and their economy. And then we start looking at their history. We look at the samurai, their period of isolation, Commodore Perry coming in. And of course, we kind of bring it all the way up through World War II. So I'm on that unit right now, and I wanted to make sure that I got this read in because it had been sitting on my shelf for a while. And what this is, I guess, one of the early examples of new journalism that is written in a more novelistic style. So a year after the bombing of Hiroshima, John Hersey, to my understanding, went over to Japan, and he got personal stories from survivors. So this was originally published, I think, as articles, if I could be wrong, in 1946. And his accounts, of course, are harrowing. We follow along some various Japanese victims, but also a German, I think it's a Jesuit. Remember, Germany and Japan were allies during that time. I don't know about that Jesuit's political affiliations, but, I can only imagine. But anyhow, he is one of the survivors. And of course, some of these stories are harrowing. There's a particular image that I can't really get out of my head, where I believe it's that Jesuit. He is trying to help people across a river in Hiroshima. These people are such terribly, they're awful burn victims all over their body. And they can't move. They're so badly burned that they can't really move. And he's trying to bring them across the river, I think in a boat, and put them on the shore on the other side, and where they could maybe find safety. And their skin is basically coming off. It's like these are like slimy bodies that he's moving. And he's exhausted. It's at night, and he goes, I think, back across the river. I might be remembering details wrong, but he falls asleep because he's just so tired. And he wakes up the next day, not anticipating the fact that the tide had come in and the water level had come up. And I guess he hadn't moved those people high enough up the bank, and they couldn't move themselves, so they ended up drowning. And it's just, you think about, incidents and images like that, and really brings home how awful this experience was. So that's kind of, almost around half the book, a little over half. But then they also added, almost 40 years later, Hersey returned to Japan, and he kind of updates us on those people and the stuff that was happening in Hiroshima. And that stuff isn't, it is interesting. It is interesting to see what the, excuse me, what victims went through, how difficult it was for them to get employment because they were so often ill, the side effects of radiation illness and cancers, and which ones had kind of been successful afterwards, which ones hadn't, which ones had helped people. There is an awful lot of people here that are Christian converts, and I'm not entirely sure if that is just accidental or if that's the kind of people that he had access to. But it's, I mean, from my understanding, the Japanese generally are not that religious to begin with. A large population isn't really religious at all. It does make it sound like there's a whole lot of Christians running around. I know there are some, but I feel like this book makes it feel like there are way more than there actually are. So a lot of the people he talks to are either in the clergy or they are converts to Catholicism. And I don't know, again, if that's just accidental or if that is a product of, the connections that he was able to make and the people he was actually able to talk to. But anyhow, we do get a lot of talk of people, finally, one woman I think becomes a nun and stuff like that. So that stuff in the second half is interesting. It's not as interesting as the first part, but it does give some, like I said, some really good insight into sort of how Hiroshima sort of rebuilt itself and the challenges that the survivors went through. But I would overall, it's a quick read. I would certainly recommend this. It's only around 150 pages. Certainly, I would recommend reading the first couple chapters, which is all about the experiences of the bomb. The Let me see, what are the chapter titles are A Noiseless Flash, The Fire, Details Are Being Investigated, Panic Graphs, and Fever View. So those chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all very, very important stuff, of course. But yeah, I'm glad I read this, and it gives me a little more perspective. I've, of course, read different things about Hiroshima, but it's been articles and stuff. I haven't really read books on it yet, so this will be my first step. But those are the two books that I read. We've got James Hogg's The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, and John Hersey's Hiroshima. If you've read either of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching. Thank you, BookTube.